What do you do when 17 years of loyalty are reduced to a single sentence, one that ends your career before your morning coffee even cools? That question haunted me the moment I stepped out of that glass-walled office, carrying nothing but a sealed envelope, a company-branded mug, and the weight of being disposable. My name is Mason Carter. I was 52 years old when I was told my position at Argonix Corp had been eliminated. No prior notice, no performance issue, no severance package ready. Just Rachel from HR watching the clock and the new COO glancing at his phone while telling me this decision was strategic. That word clanged in my ears like an alarm I couldn't shut off. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I nodded, thanked them for the opportunity, and left the room with quiet dignity. But inside, something colder than anger had begun to settle. Not rage. Calculation. As I walked past the rows of desks I helped wire years ago, I caught the quick, nervous glances of younger employees. People I had mentored, trained, shielded. None of them said a word. They didn't need to. I was already thinking 10 steps ahead. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I walked 3 extra blocks past my usual train station and sat on a worn bench in Lincoln Park, where I used to take my lunch breaks in the early years. The air was colder than I expected for late September, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut through my jacket like it had something personal against me. I needed the quiet to think. Not about the job loss. That part was done. I needed to remember how it all began. When I joined Argonix Corp, it was a fledgling tech firm operating out of a subleased floor in an outdated office building on the west side. We didn't have a receptionist, let alone a budget for ergonomic chairs. But there was promise. Back then, we were building something real, lean, driven, raw. I was hired as the second systems engineer on staff. No title, no handbook, no roadmap. Just trust and an overloaded server that crashed anytime more than 6 people logged in at once. I loved it. The systems I designed weren't flashy, but they were solid, secure. I didn't just patch holes. I built infrastructure, protocols, long-term architecture that could scale. Over time, that system grew to support a company that expanded coast to coast. With every acquisition, every department integration, I was there, ensuring nothing fell apart in the process. People like to romanticize the early days of a company, but they don't talk about the nights, the weekends, the Thanksgiving mornings I spent running diagnostics while my wife reheated my plate in the oven. The time I missed my son's school play because a database restoration took 6 hours longer than it should have. The mornings I showed up early to diffuse problems before anyone else even logged on. Loyalty wasn't a word I tossed around. It was something I lived. Argonix didn't just sign my paychecks, it shaped who I was. I turned down multiple job offers over the years, including one from a major cloud provider that would have doubled my salary. But I stayed, because this place meant something. I mentored dozens of junior engineers, many of whom are now department heads. I taught them how to think in systems, not just write clean code, but design with resilience in mind. Some of those kids still kept a notepad with tips I gave them back when they were interns. I used to joke that my real legacy wasn't in the data centers, it was in the people. But jokes aside, I never asked for much. No big promotion, no corner office. I didn't care if they named anything after me. I just wanted to build things that worked and sleep at night knowing I did right by the people who counted on me. It's a strange thing, watching your entire professional identity get boxed up in under an hour. My desk, once the anchor of a dozen projects, was now just a surface to stack my belongings. A photo of my kids on a hike in Colorado. A worn-out keyboard wrist pad that had molded itself to the shape of my arm over the years. A coffee mug my daughter gave me that said, "World's okayest engineer." A few people passed by, offered stiff smiles. Beth from facilities paused, started to say something, then just gave me a quick nod and kept walking. I didn't blame them. No one knew what to say. To them, I was part of the walls. Always there. Always reliable. Until I wasn't. The final person I passed before stepping onto the elevator was Dev Patel, a sharp coder I'd hired 6 years ago. He had just been promoted to senior developer last quarter. I caught his eye. He looked stricken, like a kid watching a favorite teacher, being sent home mid-class. He opened his mouth, closed it, then mouthed, "I'm sorry." I offered a small smile. Not because I was okay, but because I wanted him to remember that I walked out with my head up. Loyalty is complicated. It's easy to give, harder to measure, and nearly impossible to recover once it's broken. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I realized something I hadn't considered until that moment. I wasn't mourning the job. I was mourning the idea that loyalty still meant something, but that didn't mean I was finished. The shift didn't happen all at once. That's not how betrayal works, not in the corporate world. It creeps in like mold behind a wall, slow and silent, until one day the entire structure gives way. Looking back, I should have seen the signs earlier. But when you've spent years keeping the ship afloat, it's hard to imagine anyone would try to toss you overboard. It began with language, subtle, almost imperceptible changes in how leadership referred to our department. We weren't the systems division anymore. We were IT support resources. Rachel Marlowe, the newly appointed COO, brought it up in her first all-hands meeting. She stood at the front of the auditorium with her sleek tablet and confident smile, tossing out phrases like agile transformation and resource realignment, like she was reading from a corporate playbook. Cameron Wells showed up 2 weeks later. A consultant, though no one was quite clear on what he was consulting on. His LinkedIn profile read like a startup founder turned strategist with stints at flashy Silicon Valley firms. He wore tailored suits, always held his phone horizontally, like he was preparing for a TED Talk, and addressed people by job title instead of names. He didn't shake my hand the first time we met. Instead, he looked at my badge, nodded, and said, "Ah, legacy systems guy. We'll probably be working on sunsetting some of that." It wasn't a greeting, it was a warning. My access started changing about a month after he arrived. At first, I chalked it up to standard restructuring. A few systems I'd administered were now locked behind new firewalls. When I asked about it, Rachel told me it was part of a compliance upgrade suggested by Cameron's team. She said it like it was a compliment, like I should be grateful we were moving forward. Then came the meetings, or more accurately, my absence from them. Project briefings I would normally lead were suddenly rescheduled without me. Calendar invites dried up. Memos began referencing forward-facing infrastructure teams, a term that sounded impressive but meant nothing. My name stopped appearing in update threads. Even status reports I submitted disappeared without acknowledgement. Didn't confront anyone, not yet. I knew how this worked. You don't survive nearly 2 decades in tech by panicking the first time your ID badge starts feeling lighter. You observe, you document. That's what I did. It was Andrea, my wife, who finally said something one night over dinner. She watched me push roasted vegetables around my plate like I was debugging the food. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "Work okay?" I shrugged. "Just changes." "The good kind or the slow-burning, political kind?" I smiled at that. She knew the signs. She'd seen me run on adrenaline during acquisition marathons and crash after 48-hour outage drills. But this was different. This wasn't about stress. This was about being quietly erased. Things escalated when Dev, yes, the same Dev who looked so shaken the day I was fired, stopped by my office one morning with a stack of server logs and a question about routing. I started walking him through it, but the logs had been altered. My own protocols had been overwritten. I couldn't access the console I'd built. I opened a ticket with admin. The response came back 20 minutes later. Access removed per SIR. Departmental policy revision. Please refer to your team lead. I didn't have a team lead. I was the team lead. Later that week, a company-wide email went out about a new pilot program. Modernization initiatives under a streamlined technology strategy. Cameron was listed as the acting lead for digital systems transition. My title wasn't mentioned anywhere. Neither was my department. That was the moment it clicked. They weren't just marginalizing me, they were methodically erasing my footprint. Slowly deconstructing the systems I'd put in place not because they were broken, but because their existence posed a threat. to new plans, to new money, to new people who didn't want legacy, didn't want memory, getting in the way. What they didn't understand was that memory, especially in systems architecture, isn't a liability. It's the backbone. And I remembered everything. By the end of that month, I'd installed secondary monitoring tools under my own credentials. Tools they hadn't yet flagged or disabled. And that's when I started seeing it. Strange data trails, vendor activity that didn't match our procurement schedule, approval signatures that bypassed review layers I'd personally coded. I didn't know the full shape of it yet, but I knew. One thing for certain, I wasn't just being pushed out for efficiency, I was being removed for convenience. I began digging not out of revenge but out of instinct. The same instinct that had kept servers running, firewalls intact, and data safe for over a decade and a half. If I couldn't trust what was happening above the surface, I'd go beneath. And the first anomaly came during a late-night check on backup redundancies. It was a quiet Wednesday, well past midnight. Andrea had gone to bed hours earlier, and I was reviewing logs on my personal terminal, something I hadn't done in years. That's when I noticed a routine file pull that had been marked as maintenance. The request originated from a system that had supposedly been decommissioned 2 years earlier, during our cloud migration. That didn't make sense. I traced the IP and discovered it was still live, barely masked by a generic internal proxy. The access credentials were valid, too valid. They had multi-factor verification overrides and elevated clearance. Only 2 people in the company would have had that kind of admin privilege, me and someone from the executive tier. I cross-referenced recent activity and found that this old server had been interacting with an external vendor I didn't recognize, Helix Dynamics. It wasn't on any of our preferred contractor lists. Curious, I ran the vendor ID through a public records search. Nothing legitimate came up. The business address listed was a shared office suite in a strip mall in Des Moines, Iowa. Its contact number rerouted to a disconnected Google Voice account. Fake vendor. I didn't alert anyone. Not yet. I created a clone of the server environment, isolating the vendor access logs, payment confirmations, and routing tables. Then I ran pattern analysis against other procurement activity over the past 18 months. That's when things started to fall apart, or come together, depending on your perspective. The payments to Helix Dynamics began in small amounts, $12,000. Here, $1,800 there, cleverly embedded within quarterly infrastructure invoices. But they began growing, doubling, then tripling. By the time I tallied the totals, the company had paid over $6.2 million to Helix in less than 2 years. I ran the name of the person who signed off on those payments. Rachel Marlowe. Some entries included a second-level approval signature. Cameron. Wells, the system should have flagged that. Our finance approval tree was built with redundancy and alert protocols, but those had quietly been disabled, bit by bit, under the guise of simplification during Cameron's consulting phase. And the person who would have flagged those modifications? Me. The more I uncovered, the more precise it became. This wasn't sloppiness. It was calculated misdirection. The vendor profile for Helix Dynamics had been built to resemble a legitimate subcontractor. The invoice formatting mimicked our standard template with just enough variance to avoid duplicate detection. But they made one mistake. They reused a template ID that had been deprecated 3 years earlier. I had archived it myself. That breadcrumb led me to a second fake vendor, Tryon Data Systems. Different name, different fake address, same pattern. This time the company was registered to a holding firm in Nevada under an LLC owned by a man named Nolan Wells, Cameron's cousin. It was textbook fraud, using inflated or fabricated vendor invoices to siphon funds out of a company in ways that would blend into operational noise. Most external auditors would miss it, especially when the departments getting trimmed were non-revenue generating, like infrastructure, like systems, like mine. And it didn't stop there. I remembered 2 employees. In finance, Olivia Chen and Greg Santiago, who had been suddenly let go 9 months earlier for policy violations. At the time, the reason was vague. I had even sent Olivia a note when she left, thanking her for always being on point with audit trails. She never responded. I reached out again, this time from a secure email I created years ago for penetration testing, one that wasn't connected to any Active Directory or logging system. She replied the next day. She hadn't just been let go. She had raised concerns about vendor payments and was asked to stay quiet. Greg had filed an internal report that vanished before anyone acknowledged it. HR had told them both that their complaints were under review, and within 2 weeks, they were escorted out. My hands tightened around the edge of my desk as I read her message. I wasn't the first loose end they tried to tie off. I was just the most inconvenient one. I spent the next 5 days collecting everything: logs, invoices, server snapshots, vendor registration documents, internal emails that showed Cameron and Rachel referencing budget offsets and indirect expense smoothing. I even found a Slack message where Rachel wrote, "Let's scrub the old protocols. Mason still has too much visibility." They'd gotten comfortable. Too comfortable. I created a master report, compiled in chronological order, annotated, hyperlinked to source data. It spanned 78 pages and included a flowchart showing the movement of funds, vendor shell ownership, and timelines of executive actions. Then, I printed 2 hard copies and encrypted 4 digital ones, storing them across secure cloud, locations, and 2 physical flash drives. I wasn't going to the board, not yet. First, I needed to know who else was in on it and what they were willing to risk to keep it hidden. But I had already made a silent vow. No matter what they offered, me, money, silence, reinstatement, I wasn't walking away. Not this time. I knew the moment I hit print on that 78-page dossier that I'd crossed an invisible line. Up until then, I'd been reacting, quietly observing, quietly documenting, quietly connecting dots. But now, I was preparing for something else entirely. A move. A precise, calculated shift from passive observer to active force. The plan wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about restoration, of trust, of accountability, and maybe in some strange way of myself. I had been erased quietly, methodically. Now I would return. Not with noise, but with proof so irrefutable it would speak for itself. First, I needed leverage. Something that couldn't be dismissed as a disgruntled ex-employee's accusation. They'd expect that. They'd frame it that way. No, I needed timing. Precision. I needed to deliver this truth in a way that couldn't be spun or silenced. So I began where any engineer would, by mapping out the system. Argonix was preparing for its initial public offering. It was a massive deal. Internal chatter suggested it would launch in a matter of weeks, pending regulatory clearance and final financial reviews. The executive team had already begun their pre-IPO press tours. Rachel was quoted in Forbes TechWatch talking about Argonix's ethical leadership culture. I had to laugh at that one. An IPO meant due diligence. It meant audits, regulatory filings, and oversight. If I timed things right, the fraud I had uncovered wouldn't just rattle a few executives, it would force a full-scale internal investigation. It would delay the IPO, cost millions, maybe more. So I waited. In the meantime, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in over 5 years, Daniel Fraser, an old colleague who now worked at the Department of Labor. Daniel and I had survived the early years of Argonix together, building firewalls in the middle of the night and eating bad pizza on data migration weekends. He'd always had a deep respect for clean process and deeper contempt for corporate sleight of hand. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't hesitate. "Send it to my personal address," he said, "and don't put your name anywhere near it." I did one better. I created an anonymized whistleblower package complete with timestamps, backup source files, and detailed annotations. Then I mailed a copy to Daniel. Another to the SEC regional office in Chicago, marked confidential. But the internal delivery, that would be the surgical strike. I spent the next week preparing the digital infrastructure for it. I resurrected an old testing environment I'd used during Argonix's cybersecurity training rollout. Back then, we'd built a sandbox version of our email system for simulated phishing exercises. What no one remembered was that the environment still existed on a private server I had full root access to. and that I'd used it to mirror the internal directory for stress testing. I repurposed it to craft the perfect delivery vehicle. ATO, series of internal-looking emails from a domain visually identical to Argonix's, routed through secure relays, landing directly in the inboxes of the people who mattered: executive board members, legal counsel, internal audit. It would look like an ordinary internal alert until they opened the file. Meanwhile, I reached out to another quiet ally, Karen Vance, a former VP of compliance who had retired 2 years earlier after clashing repeatedly with Rachel. I had once helped Karen dig through network traffic logs to uncover a backdoor installed by a third-party contractor. She hadn't forgotten that. When I told her I needed a meeting with someone on the board, someone with integrity, she offered a name: Gerald Stone, chair of the finance subcommittee. He reads everything, she said. He also hates being blindsided. Perfect, I called. Gerald, from a prepaid burner, introduced myself calmly, reminded him of the cross-department security overhaul I'd led 4 years ago, the one that saved the company from a 7-figure ransomware threat. I told him I had evidence of financial irregularities that, if not addressed, would place the entire IPO in legal jeopardy. I didn't beg for a meeting. I simply said, "I think you'll want to see this before the press does." He agreed. Next day we met at a quiet cafe north of the city. I handed him a sealed envelope and said only, "If even half of what's in there is true, your boardroom is going to need new locks." He flipped through the pages for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he looked up. "How long have you been sitting on this?" "Long enough to be sure. You realize this could bury people. They were the ones holding the shovel." He nodded once and left without another word. Now I just had to wait. I scheduled the internal email drop for Tuesday at 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes into the board's weekly strategy sync. I made sure it bypassed spam filters and logged as a legitimate internal alert. I even timed the message header to reference the exact procurement code from one of the doctored invoices. The subject line read, "Urgent. Review required. Vendor. Payment irregularities, Helix, Tryon Crosswalk." Attached was a clean PDF summary, no color, no drama, just facts. They wouldn't be able to ignore it. Or deny it. My phone was on silent. My laptop was clean, my backups were stored off-site. I didn't plan to send follow-ups or press for reaction. I didn't need to. The truth, once released, has a way of spreading all on its own. And by the time they realized how deep the rot ran, I'd already be on the outside watching everything I once built either collapse or finally be rebuilt the right way. Tuesday arrived like a slow-building storm. Gray skies, a breeze too still to trust. I woke earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but clarity. The kind of calm that settles in when you've rehearsed something enough times in your head to feel inevitable. Andrea handed me a cup of coffee, saying nothing. She knew. Not the details. I'd spared her those, but enough to understand that something important was about to unfold. By 8:45 a.m., I was parked in my car 3 blocks from Argonix headquarters. Not hiding, but positioned, close enough to feel the pulse, far enough to remain invisible. My laptop sat in the passenger seat, screen black but ready. My phone showed a countdown clock set to 9:15 a.m. sharp. At exactly 9:14 and 55 seconds, the message queued. 5 seconds later, it was live. The email landed in the inboxes of 11 board members, 4 legal department contacts, and 2 senior compliance officers. Subject: Urgent. Review required. Vendor payment irregularities. Helix, Tryon Crosswalk. The document attached wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. No narrative, no commentary, just structured evidence, step by step. Impossible to dismiss: names, dates, account numbers, registration links, cross-referenced vendor IDs. I didn't expect fireworks. I expected silence, the kind that falls when someone in power reads something that can't be unseen. And I was right. By 9:30, my phone vibrated. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out. Then another. This one I knew. Rachel Marlowe, followed by Cameron Wells. I silenced both. I had no interest in their attempts to spin. At 9:42, a text arrived from Dev. Something's up. Emergency meeting. Rachel looks pale. Cameron's pacing. Then another 30 seconds later. Boards locked in a room. Legal pulled in. What did you do? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. At 10:05, I received an email from Vanessa in HR, one of the few people still operating under the illusion that this was a standard personnel matter. Her message was measured. Corporate Mr. Carter, we've received a concerning communication that appears to originate from you regarding confidential company information. Please be reminded of your obligations under the Employee Separation Agreement. Any further contact with Argonix employees may result in legal consequences. Interesting. They still thought they were dealing with someone who needed to be silenced. I had never signed a separation agreement. They'd dismissed me with no warning, no paperwork, no NDA. That oversight would prove costly. By noon, news broke on a local business feed. Argonix Corp delays IPO filing amid internal financial review. The article cited unnamed sources within the company and noted a material discrepancy in vendor payments under executive oversight. No names were listed, yet. But it was enough. I watched the stock discussion forums light up with speculation. Cameron must have realized just how far the damage could spread. At 12:47 he called again. This time I answered. Mason, he said quickly, his voice calm but strained. We need to talk. I don't work for Argonix anymore. This doesn't have to escalate. We can... Look, there's room to negotiate here. No, I replied. There really isn't. There's no reason for this to get messy. If you've got concerns, we can walk through them. But going to the board, to the press, that crosses a line. No, I said again, slower this time. What you did cross the line. I'm just turning the lights on. He hesitated. What do you want? Nothing, I said. That's the part you don't understand. This isn't about a settlement. It's about accountability. I hung up. At 2:30, I received an encrypted email from Gerald Stone, the board, finance chair. It was brief, received, reviewing documentation. Your diligence is appreciated. We'll be in touch. By 3:00, internal panic turned to executive chaos. Dev texted again. Security just escorted Rachel out. CFO too. People are whispering. Whispering would soon give way to headlines. At 3:47, Tech Pulse Midwest published a breaking alert. Exclusive. Argonix executives under review for shell vendor fraud. This time, names were included. By 5 year, Rachel had deleted her LinkedIn profile. Cameron made his private. The damage was in motion. And still, I said nothing publicly. My part was done. But behind the scenes, a new current had begun to stir. At 6:15 that evening, Gerald called me directly. Mason, he said, the board convened an emergency session this afternoon. I listened. Rachel and Cameron have been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. We've brought in an external forensic accounting firm. The legal department is preparing notifications to regulators. The IPO is officially postponed. I assumed as much, I said. We're grateful, he added, for how thorough your report was, and for how quietly you handled it. I appreciated that. I hadn't stormed in or shouted from rooftops. I had let the facts do their work. That was always my way, but Gerald wasn't finished. The board would like to offer you a formal role, Chief Integrity Officer, full autonomy, direct line to oversight. We need someone who understands not just systems, but ethics. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wasn't interested, but because I needed to feel it. The weight of it. The reality of being asked back not as a placeholder, but as a safeguard. I'll think about it, I finally said. That night, as I stood at the window of my study, watching traffic wind through the city, Andrea came in with a quiet look on her face. She didn't need to ask how the day went. She saw it in my posture. Are you okay? She asked. I am now, I said, because for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel erased. I didn't feel silenced. I didn't feel like a system being phased out. I felt seen, and sometimes that's the first step to reclaiming everything they tried to take. The fallout came fast, faster than even I had anticipated. By Wednesday morning, the entire executive floor of Argonix was on lockdown. Rachel's office door, once constantly ajar to give the illusion of accessibility, now sat closed behind temporary frosted glass marked "Under Internal Review." Her nameplate had been removed before lunch. By the end of the day, she was officially placed on indefinite leave. Cameron, ever the showman, tried to maintain his image, circulating through lower departments with a strained smile, pretending he was still consulting on optimization workflows. But no one bought it. Word had already spread. The article from Tech Pulse Midwest had gone viral in industry circles. In the comments section, former Argonix employees hinted at irregularities, going back even further, and a few quietly thanked whoever had exposed the rot. Internally, morale was tense but invigorated. People began asking questions loudly. Then came Thursday. At 10:17 a.m., an email from the board was sent to all employees, an official statement confirming an ongoing investigation into significant financial misconduct involving third-party vendor relationships. The message emphasized Argonix's commitment to transparency, accountability, and ethical governance moving forward. It stopped just short of naming names, but everyone already knew. The media followed quickly. By noon, Bloomberg Tech Brief ran a story titled, "6 Million Vendor Fraud Scandal Rocks Argonix IPO Plans." By Friday, the SEC had issued a formal notice of inquiry. Legal teams began scrubbing through 3 years of financial records with a fine-toothed comb. Employees who had previously kept their heads down now found themselves summoned for interviews with compliance officers. The most remarkable shift, however, wasn't just structural. It was cultural. People who had once whispered in hallways about the untouchables on the executive floor now walked taller. Engineers whose ideas had been dismissed were being called into meetings with board liaisons. It felt as though the company had been cracked open, and sunlight was finally hitting places that hadn't seen it in years. For me, the transformation was personal. On Monday morning, I received a formal letter from the board, signed by Gerald Stone and 2 independent directors. They thanked me for my extraordinary diligence and ethical leadership, and extended a renewed offer for the easy position of Chief Integrity Officer, reporting directly to the board. The role would come with a clean mandate, full authority over internal audit and compliance systems, a direct budget, and a standing seat at quarterly financial review sessions. I met with Gerald in person the following day in the same conference room where I'd once trained a group of interns on cybersecurity basics. "We want you to build something that outlasts this scandal," he said. "Not a department, a standard." I didn't give him an answer immediately. I told him I needed time, not because I doubted the role, but because I knew what it would require of me. Walking back into Argonix, even as a leader, meant confronting the place that had once cast me out like I was redundant. I wasn't sure if I wanted to return, only this time with a badge that could unlock any room. I talked it through with Andrea that night. She listened as she always did, more interested in what I felt than what I planned. "Is this about finishing something?" she asked, "or starting over?" "A bit of both," I said. In the end, it wasn't about power, it was about the people, still inside. The quiet engineers, the junior analysts, the mid-level project managers who believed in the mission but were afraid to speak up. I owed it to them. And in a way, I owed it to myself. I accepted the offer on Thursday. My return wasn't dramatic. No speeches, no town halls. Just a quiet morning in a freshly cleaned office with no nameplate yet. The view overlooked the skyline, but what mattered more was what was beneath it. The departments I once served, the people who still remembered the systems I'd built, and now knew the story of how I'd defended them. My first act was to reinstate Olivia Chen and Greg Santiago, the two finance team members who had been fired for noticing what they weren't supposed to see. I called them personally and offered them roles in the new Risk and Compliance office. Both accepted without hesitation. I promoted Dev to head of systems operations. He was young but sharp. He reminded me of myself 2 decades ago, before cynicism crept in, before I learned how loyalty could be weaponized. I knew he would lead with integrity. He just needed someone to back him when it mattered. Within a month, the Integrity Office had become more than a department. It was a symbol. Engineers started emailing anonymous reports of odd procurement activity, conflicts of interest, questionable decisions. They no longer feared retaliation. They knew someone was listening now. Meanwhile, the board moved swiftly. Rachel Marlowe officially resigned, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. Cameron vanished from industry circles, his consulting site quietly taken offline. The final forensic audit estimated a total of $6.8 million had been siphoned through Helix Dynamics and Trion data systems over a 2-year period. Some funds were recovered, others were gone. But the message had been sent. Systems are only as honest as the people who run them. Argonix delayed its IPO by 6 months, but emerged stronger. Investors were wary at first, but once the transparency measures were made public, confidence returned. I wasn't involved in the IPO anymore. That wasn't my lane, but I reviewed every contract with an auditor's eye, every line of code with the vigilance of someone who knew what silence could cost. By the time the quarter ended, I had rewritten the company's internal governance protocols, added mandatory ethics training for all executives, and created an anonymous whistleblower platform directly under my office's jurisdiction. The company had changed, and so had I. One afternoon, months later, I passed by the server room where my journey had truly begun. I paused, listening to the familiar hum of machines, fans, and circuits all speaking in their quiet, consistent rhythm. It struck me how much of my life had been shaped in rooms like that. Hidden, technical, invisible, but not anymore. Now, the things once hidden were being brought into the light, not through force but through design, and I had built it. This time, the system wasn't just functional. It was just, in every company, in every organization, there are 2 kinds of people: those who follow the rules and those who learn how to bend them, quietly, profitably, and often without consequence. Mason Carter was the former. For 17 years he played by the book, until the moment he realized the book had been rewritten behind his back. What this story reveals isn't just corporate fraud, it's the quiet erosion of values that happens when no one is paying attention. Mason didn't bring down a system out of spite. He exposed it because the truth mattered more than comfort, more than ego, more than revenge. And maybe that's the real lesson here. It's not enough to build great systems. You have to protect them, not just with code and audits, but with integrity. Because when leadership forgets who actually holds the company together, the ones they underestimate can become the ones who hold it accountable. Question for you. Have you ever seen someone in power get away with something because no one was willing to speak up? Tell us in the comments. Your voice might inspire someone else to do the right thing. If this story kept you watching, share it, like it, or hit subscribe. We've got more stories that prove. Sometimes the quiet ones change everything.